So, colleagues, friends, you're all very, very welcome. Those of you who are joining us online, it's great to have so many people here this evening. We really are delighted to be hosting what we think will be an absolutely fascinating discussion, which is our last behind the headlines discussion of this academic year on what it means to be human in the 21st century. Of course, tonight's discussion forms part of the Trinity Longroom Hub's Behind the Headline, and this is a format that I recognise many faces in the audience, so you're familiar with it. But for those of you who aren't, what we want to do in these discussions is to apply the long-term perspectives of the arts and humanities, but also to work across science, both the physical sciences, the biological sciences, and the social sciences. And particularly with this series, we're absolutely delighted to be working with Enterprise and particularly the end. There should even be flyers. I see one. There's the Accenture team is here. So those white flyers are what you're looking for. Hopefully they're on your seat so you can pick one up as you go out. They'll give you a little bit more information about the lecture series. So back to this evening. So tonight's panel discussion really is a taster for the series, and I'm so delighted to welcome four hugely distinguished speakers. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. And then the drill is as usual. Each speaker has 9 minutes, and we're really strict about the time in here. So they speak for 9 minutes, and then it'll be over to you for questions and answers, and then back to our speakers to wrap things up. But our first speaker tonight is Lorna Ross. And Lorna Ross is an amazing woman. As I say, I've had the absolute privilege of working with her since August. She's got a career in design, and I guess it spans more than 25 years. But Lorna, look at you, you wouldn't think so. It's like you just, I was going to say, it seems like, don't say anything. But her career, yeah, in the world of fashion, wearable technology, and most recently healthcare. She's a futurist at heart, and she really is recognised for her ability to anticipate shifts in the social, cultural and economic context for design. And she has brought this wealth of expertise here to the doc and to Accenture. And as I say, she's played this extraordinary, inspiring role working with us in the Trinity Long Room Hub, and she'll say a few words about the work that we are doing together. But it's really lovely to welcome others from Accenture. Anyone else from Accenture here tonight? There's a couple of you. Well, you're extremely... Yeah, that's great. No pressure, Lorna. But it's been a joy to work with you all, and we're developing this sub-lab that Fiona is leading. So Lorna is our first speaker tonight. Our second speaker tonight is also a very, very special person, and somebody who knows the Trinity Long Room Hub well. He's Mark O'Connell. He's a non-fiction writer from Dublin. But you might know Mark because of his amazing book, To Be a Machine, Adventures Amongst Cyborgs, Utopians, Hackers, and the Future Solving the Modest Problem of Death. What a title. But Mark's book won an extraordinarily prestigious award from the Wellcome Foundation in 2018, and it's been shortlisted for other extremely distinguished book prizes, including that of the Royal Society Science Book Prize. He writes for some very interesting papers, and including the New York Times Magazine, The Guardian, The New Yorker. But I'm really proud to say he's got a PhD in English from Trinity, and he was an early career researcher in the Trinity Long Room Hub in 2013-14. So Mark, you're extremely welcome. Welcome back. You're never going to escape now. I should also have said that Mark's work was all funded by the Irish Research Council, and I have to get that chair of the Irish Research Council. So when there's an opportunity to give it a plug, it's always very important. Our third speaker this evening is Kevin Mitchell. And Kevin Mitchell is currently the senior lecturer in Trinity, so he has a major leadership role in the university, but he's found time to publish, again, a remarkable book, but he's an associate professor in the Smurfit Institute of Genetics and a member of the Trinity College Institute of Neuroscience, TCIN. And we in the Hub have been working very closely with TCIN to do some fabulous work in the whole space of neurohumanities. So Kevin's interests are about understanding the genetic program specifying the wiring of the brain and its relevance to variation in human faculties. And as I say, he's just published a fantastic book called Innate, How the Wiring of Our Brains Shapes Who We Are. And he's just back from a big lecture tour in the US. So we're, again, Kevin, absolutely delighted you're here. And then last but not least is Genevieve Bell. And Genevieve Bell is probably somebody who doesn't need a huge introduction because she is extremely well known. She's the distinguished professor at the Australian National University and senior fellow at Intel. She's a cultural anthropologist and is best known for her work at the intersection of cultural practice and technology development. She currently heads up the 3A Institute, and hopefully she might say a word or two about that tonight, but what she's tasked herself with doing is building a new applied science around the management of artificial intelligence, data, technology and their impact on humanity. And both Lorna and Genevieve have been involved in discussions we've been having all afternoon, a fascinating set of discussions with enterprise in this whole area of how the arts and humanities can work more closely with companies like Intel, Xilinx and Accenture. So I'm really delighted that they still have the energy to come and speak this evening. And obviously Genevieve has come a long way. She was performing in Dingle at the weekend to what was a fantastic event. So without further ado, we're going to welcome Lorna Ross to the stage. However, and please switch your mobile phones to silent. However, feel free to tweet, and we'd love you to use the hashtag #HubMatters. So, Lorna, over to you.
Thank you, Jane. Okay, 9 minutes. Okay, everyone who knows me knows. So I'd like to apologize. I'm going to read my notes. Oh, I keep seeing people I know. This is horrible. I'll look at my. So I was Jane mentioned that just really quickly, the Human Insights Lab is a very new initiative at the DOC, Accenture's Innovation Centre that's just down in Rogerson's Quay. And I wanted to share how novice we feel in this topic. And as a kind of characteristic of being novice, I have notes, and I'm not as fluent in this conversation as I'd like to be. But I'm going to just tee up, hopefully, what is going to be maybe a more, kind of more conversation later on about why we're here, why we're partnering with Trinity, why Accenture is funding a new lab around human insights. And so I'm going to have to kind of give you the backstory a little bit. So forgive me, but I'm going to read this so it's easier for me to not get lost. So if we are to believe the persistent voices right now, humans both at an individual level and humankind as a whole will increasingly have to deal with things we've never encountered before. I'm not sure how significant that is, given that most historians, such as Jane, would argue that this kind of anxiety is common to every generation. However, at a time what feels like unprecedented change, and certainly there's a narrative around that we are at some inflection point, in terms of our human civilization and evolution, and many of us have experienced that niggling doubt when we think that things that we believed as timeless wisdoms have in fact become outdated biases. So I don't know about you, but sometimes confronted with some of the things that we're considering right now, I don't know what kind of frame of reference to use anymore. And I wonder about the kind of our ability to look back and to learn enough about about what we're facing, thinking about the history and the patterns that we've experienced. So science for generations, for 3 centuries in fact, has shaped how we see the world, how we understand it. It's given us names for things and ways to quantify and measure everything around us, and it's determined what we believe to be true and what we all agree is real. Now, more recently, technology, which we consider science's little sister, has assumed a really similar role culturally, and more recently is shaping what we believe also and what we think is true. So there's this kind of parallel, the kind of migration of a lot of the language coming out of science moving into tech. So clearly technology is not bad. If you know what you want in life, technology can help you get it. But if you don't know what you want, it will all too easily shape your aims for you. So as we sink deeper into a culture of distraction, we need to consider not only why we are so easily distracted, but what we seek distraction from. We need to view with some skepticism the narrative dominating currently, propagated from a utopian, tech-centric view of the world. So many of our economies are increasingly aligned to the tech industry, and such a powerful influence and reach into our lives is shaping how we think and how we feel about the world around us, and indeed how we feel about ourselves and each other. So our fear is not the machines themselves, the technology themselves. It's more our eroding confidence in our ability to agree how much we want our worlds to be shaped by them. Degrading trust in government amplifies our feelings of hopelessness and inevitability as we struggle to align on what is true and what we should believe. This sense of tech fatalism seems to have established itself deeply in both public and corporate narratives, and those who would question, they run the risk of being viewed as Luddite. It's not hard to be consumed with this anxiety, this tech anxiety, and yet it's deceptively distracting from a much bigger issue. Perhaps we should be more consumed with philosophical questions about humanity, given the perceived uncertainty of our future. For example, do we have the right definition of intelligence? AI systems are, in truth, not all that terribly smart yet. But if we keep talking about them as if they are, we run the risk of biasing our measure of human intelligence towards the synthetic. I would argue that education should not be about keeping pace with technology. That's a race we won't win, nor should we want to. Offering our children skills with diminished economic and social value is deeply irresponsible. We need more accountability in education, but even more important, we need a vision that leads with human optimism. As the Human Insights Labs embarks on its work, its single focus will be to understand what the most important questions of our time are. These are not questions about technology, but questions about ourselves and our relationship with the tools that we build. In collaboration with Trinity Longroom Hub, we look forward to hosting a series of interdisciplinary conversations, similar to the one tonight, kicking off tonight, where hopefully these questions will be shaped. That's it.
No, Lorna, thank you.
Thanks. Well, like Lorna, I'm going to stick pretty closely to the script here. Should be able to get it done within 9 minutes without rushing. I might talk for a little bit longer. Just last week, Elon Musk, the billionaire founder of Tesla and SpaceX and co-founder of PayPal, gave an interview aired on the American network HBO, in which he talked about his newest business called Neuralink. Neuralink is a so-called neurotechnology company aimed at developing methods by which human brains might eventually be connected at the neuron level to artificial intelligence. This, Musk suggested, could probably be done within a decade and would affect what he called a kind of democratization of intelligence. If we have billions of people, he said, with the high bandwidth link to the AI extension of themselves, it would actually make everyone hyper smart. The alternative to merging our brains with AI, he claimed, was that our own technological creation would inevitably make us obsolete as a species. Just as the so-called lower primates have fared pretty badly under the reign of we humans, their habitats destroyed, forced into zoos for our entertainment and so forth, the growing power of AI, Musk warned, could lead to humanity being hoarded into zoo-like portions of the planet, or indeed being wiped out entirely by this superior form of intelligence. And so the merger of humans and machine intelligence becomes, in this view, a matter of existential urgency. Musk is certainly the most prominent advocate for the merger of machine and human intelligence, but he's by no means alone in advancing this dichotomy of human obsolescence versus the kind of technological transcendence. It's a vision I myself am pretty familiar with, having written a book for which I spent about 2 years on and off immersed in the world of what's called transhumanism, a social movement largely focused on, but by no means limited to, Silicon Valley, and predicated on the idea that we can and should use technology as a means of transcending our animal-human condition to augment our cognitive powers and radically extend our lifespans and so forth. Another highly prominent advocate of transhumanist ideas is a person named Ray Kurzweil. Kurzweil is the inventor of many ingenious devices, including the flatbed scanner, and is these days the director of engineering at Google. In 2005, he published a book called The Singularity Is Near, in which he outlines how, in the pretty near future, he says by 2045, although it kind of moves back a little bit as the technology fails to get sophisticated enough. But he says that artificial intelligence is going to become so sophisticated and so powerful that we'll be able to upload our minds to AI supercomputers and merge with this technology in a final liberation from biology itself. So this basically is the notion of the singularity, which is often referred to more or less dismissively, but not, I think, entirely or unfairly, as the rapture of the nerds. So this picture that Kurzweil paints of the future is one in which technology continues to get smaller and more powerful until such time as its accelerating evolution becomes the primary agent of our own future evolution of the species. So we'll no longer carry computers around with us, he says, but rather take them into our bodies, into our brains and our bloodstreams, thereby changing the entire nature of the human experience. The vision of a future advanced by people like Musk and like Kurzweil is, I think, primarily attractive to people who already think of themselves as machines. People who agree with the artificial intelligence pioneer Marvin Minsky that, and I apologize for this quote, the human brain happens to be a meat machine. Why would we, machines that we ultimately are, not choose to upgrade ourselves to a higher degree of functionality to attain what Musk calls superhuman cognition? If we understand a machine to be an apparatus constructed for the performance of a particular task, then our task as machines is surely to think, to compute at the highest level possible. In this deeply instrumentalist view of human life, It's more or less our duty, and pretty much the whole point of our existing in the first place, to increase our computational firepower and to ensure that as machines we run as efficiently as possible for as long as possible. This is Kurzweil in The Singularity Is Near. He says, "Our version 1.0 biological bodies are frail and subject to a myriad of failure modes, not to mention the cumbersome maintenance rituals they require. While human intelligence is sometimes capable of soaring in its creativity and expressiveness, much human thought is derivative, petty, and circumscribed. The singularity will allow us to transcend these limitations of our biological bodies and brains. We will gain power over our fates. Our mortality will be in our own hands." What Kurzweil is saying here is, I think, a vision of what millenarian prophets have been saying for centuries, that we will finally escape the fallen condition of our humanity, finally become unfleshed. We will be restored to a kind of prelapsarian state of wholeness, a final union in which technology will take the place of God. One of the key ideas in any consideration of these proposed future technologies is the notion of obsolescence. Transhumanists, when they speak about the human body, the fleshy hardware on which we run the software of our minds, tend to speak of it as an outmoded technology. We are already machines in this view, it's just that we happen to be hopelessly antiquated machines. Machines that were designed for use on the African savannah hundreds of thousands of years ago, and which are just not sufficiently up to date to the requirements of contemporary life. Flesh, in other words, is a dead format. This notion of the human body as an obsolete technology seems at first very strange, almost alien. It's a disturbing way of thinking about human life. And it was for me, certainly, when I began to encounter it, and in many ways it still is. But if you think about it in terms of certain anxieties that underlie the relationship between human beings and technology in the capitalist system in which we all find ourselves, then it comes to make an odd kind of sense. One of the great shadows of fear and uncertainty that falls over our time is caused by the looming tide of automation that's rushing towards us. It's difficult to overstate the scale of the social and economic upheavals that artificial intelligence is likely to bring. A great many jobs, whole sectors of the employment economy, may well become obsolete as more and more areas of human skill and expertise become synthesized by machines. Increasingly, we live in a world governed by systems we struggle to understand. Stock markets rise and fall in response to the fluctuations of incomprehensible AI systems. Systems of human relation, from who we date to how we vote, are increasingly influenced by the whims of unseen algorithms. So it's against this background that the anxiety of human obsolescence takes hold. With regard to the increasing power and sophistication of technology, transhumanism could be seen as taking a kind of, if you can't beat them, join them position. Joining, in this case, being the startlingly literal business of merging our minds with technology. So how likely is it to come to pass, this proposed merger? How likely are we to wind up living in a world where Elon Musk is providing us, or more likely our social and economic betters, with the means towards what he calls superhuman cognition? For what it's worth, I find it hard to imagine that the singularity is actually near. But in any case, I never really conceived of my book as being about the capital F future. What's always interested me about the future, as an idea, as a fantasy, as a nightmare, is what it can tell us about the present. Transhumanism presents a vision of imminent and radical change in the human condition. In the case of the singularity, the vision is almost explicitly apocalyptic. And apocalyptic visions always tell us a lot more about the time in which they were written than they do about the future. The singularity, the idea of a merger of human and machine intelligence, tells us at least as much about the world we currently inhabit as it does about any possible future. One of the transhumanists I met while doing the reporting for my book, a self-proclaimed cyborg who designed and built technology for implanting in his own body, asked me a question that stuck with me. It was late one night and we were sitting around drinking beers in his basement and talking about the future. And he had his iPhone in his hand and he lifted it up towards me and he said, "What if we're already living in the singularity?" It's a question I think about a lot, because maybe the singularity is nothing more and nothing less than a myth about contemporary techno-capitalism, an elaborate story that illuminates how things already are and how they have in some sense always been. Because to talk about a merger of humans with technology is simply to talk about being human. Because of course you can't even begin to try to define what a human being is without talking about technology. We became human when we started using tools. So maybe the singularity began when the first Neolithic human picked up a rock and bashed it against another rock to make fire. Maybe your existence as a cyborg is affirmed every time your phone buzzes in your pocket with a notification. Every time you navigate your way through the city by means of a GPS system in your hand, signaling your position to a satellite orbiting the Earth. Maybe the singularity, in other words, is over here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's a great setup, actually, for what I'm going to talk about. Thanks to Jane very much and all the organisers for the invitation. This has already been really fun. I'm going to give you a different view, and I want to start with what I think is our best understanding of where our individual natures come from. So we're not born as blank slates. We all do have innate predispositions, and they come partly from our genetics and influences on the way our brains are wired. So in all of you, we all have a human genome. That human genome encodes the instructions for making a human being with a human brain that has human nature, generally speaking. So differences between our DNA and other species explain the differences between our respective natures, so between humans and chimps, for example. And the same thing applies to individual humans. Differences in our genomes that encode that program of brain development give rise to differences in the way our brains are structured, literally the way that they're wired, the way that they function, and thereby influence our psychological traits. So we do have innate predispositions, bless you, that affect many aspects of our psychology, our personality, intelligence, sexuality, even perception, the way we perceive the world. All of those things have some innate biological differences between us, partly from the way our genes are, but also partly just from the way the program of development plays out in each of us to give a unique outcome. And those predispositions play an increasing, a cascading, continuing role across the trajectories of our lives. So they don't determine our behavior on a moment-by-moment basis, but they influence the way that we develop, they influence the way our characters emerge, they influence the way our habits emerge over time. And we are learning not just that general point, that that's the case, but we're learning a lot more about the specific details. We're finding specific genetic variations that affect intelligence or personality. We're finding specific neural markers or aspects of brain circuitry that affect personality traits and so on. And with that knowledge comes, I think, two important implications for what it means to be human. And the first of those is really conceptual. What do we feel like it means to be human? And we heard partly, I think, from Mark's talk, this idea that we're just meat machines. That there's a very mechanistic view of how our brains work, and this feeling that if we can describe it and reduce it down to that level of molecules and neural circuits, that means we're just automata. Actually, we're just reacting to things. We're not really in control. We don't really have free will. We didn't choose our traits. We didn't choose our predispositions. We can't necessarily override them, and in some way, they influence our behavior throughout our whole lives. So there's a danger, I think, in presenting that kind of picture in an overly deterministic way, because I don't think it is deterministic. That influence of genes and the way our brain is wired is important, but it's only part of it. It's only the baseline. It's where we start, but actually our characters emerge through our experiences. Of course, our traits influence our experiences. They influence the way we react to those experiences, but we still have lived experiences as human beings. Our narrative is still the most important thing on a daily basis that makes our behavior, determines our behavior in any given situation. Because, in fact, we're never in any given situation. We're always in some particular situation. That's what life is, just one damn thing after another. So that's the idea that we don't have free will or agency, the idea that neuroscience in some way rejects that is nonsense. It doesn't at all. It just means we have to think a little bit more clearly about how that agency can emerge in the physical structure of a brain And if we get too reductionist about it, then we miss the big picture, because it's the big patterns that matter, not the low-level details. So there is a conceptual effect, I think, of increasing knowledge of genetics and neuroscience on the way we think of ourselves. There's also some very practical effects in terms of that technology. So one of them is that we can predict. We can look at people's genes now. We can predict things like intelligence. We can predict things like personality traits to a certain extent. Not very well at all, actually. But in an actuarial sense, in a statistical sense, we can explain some of the differences in the population. And if I genotyped everyone in this room here, I could put you somewhere on a normal curve of, say, intelligence, with a pretty wide margin of error for every individual person. So there is an ability to predict, however poor it is at the moment, and it's getting better all the time. What are people going to use that for? Well, people are already proposing it as a kind of a genetic aptitude test. So the idea that we can, rather than doing IQ tests in children, we can just look at their genotypes and stream them into particular classes in schools, or, for example, use that for employers, or for insurance companies, or for recruitment. So all kinds of possible things that genetic information could be used for. Even if it's a crappy predictor, it may still be statistically a useful predictor for some things. The other thing is that we can select embryos. So we can predict traits prior to a human being ever existing, that there is an embryo, and people are already doing this, of course, in vitro fertilization. They screen versus various diseases. They may select for sex in some jurisdictions, for example. And with this sort of technology, if you're able to get a predicted IQ score, genetically speaking, then people may be able to choose between one embryo or another that has a higher score for that, or for any other trait that you want. And there's a company recently in the States called Genomic Prediction that has proposed to do exactly this. So this isn't science fiction. This is happening already right now, and we haven't really had an ethical discussion about what that means or what the effects might be. Now, the third aspect is a little even starker, I think. It's the ability to manipulate, not just predict or select, but actually go into an embryo and use genome editing techniques like CRISPR that you might have heard of, to actually change the genes in an embryo and thereby influence its psychological traits. Now, this has apparently already been done. Last week in China, there was an announcement that several embryos were edited. It was for a gene that supposedly gives immunity to HIV infection. It was a horrendously unethical thing to do, completely unregulated, but the genie is out of the bottle. This can happen. If we can predict these psychological traits, you can bet that someone's going to try to do this. So there are some interesting implications of that. I think some of them are just social, again, coming back to the conception of what it means to be human. I think in some sense that idea, there's a potential commodification of children there. There's an idea that if you're going to choose between them on the basis of some of these psychological traits, you're making a judgment. You're making a value judgment that some of them are better than others. It's better to be more intelligent than less. So you'd rather have the child that will be more intelligent than the one that will be less or predicted to be. So that, to me, potentially changes the relationship between parents and children in ways that we probably can't fully anticipate what all the consequences of that would be. In an interesting way, I think it also, you can ask the question, I mean, right now we all just sort of turn out a certain way. No one has made us that certain way, but if somebody has made a choice for you to be a certain way, then are you responsible for it? Are they responsible for it? You know, what happens if you go up to be a criminal and they did something that influences that? Where does the responsibility lie if you're actually tinkering with those traits before they're manifested in an individual? Okay, so that's the scary prospect. Now I want to roll back on that a little bit because there's one really important point about this. So currently our genetic predictions of psychological traits are really poor. Definitely they're going to get better, but they're going to reach a limit beyond which we can never go in principle, not just in practice. And the reason for that is that the relationship between our genotypes, our individual genetic profiles, and our traits is, especially our psychological traits, is not very tight. There's a lot of variation. So we all have a human genome, codes for making a human brain. My My version of that genome codes for making a brain like mine, but not exactly mine. Every time that program is run, a different outcome happens. The genome just encodes a program, it doesn't encode the specific outcome. All it has is the biochemical rules by which the brain self-organizes, but it's a really noisy, variable process. So not from anything outside the embryo or outside the organism, just variation in the processes of development themselves. What that means is that no matter how good our genetic knowledge gets, and no matter how good our genetic predictions get, our ability to actually predict the phenotype will always be fuzzy. It will always be just a bit crap, to be honest. But that doesn't mean people won't try. Thank you.
So were we meeting in my home country, this event would have begun with a ritual. It would have begun with someone, perhaps an Indigenous person, standing on stage and welcoming all of us onto their country. It would have been done in language, and it would have followed a formulation that goes something like, I want to acknowledge that we meet today on the traditional lands, the place where I live now, the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I want to acknowledge their ancestors past and present, and their leaders emerging, and pay my respects to the place that we come from. The reason we do that in Australia, and it's a relatively new ritual for settlers to do, Aboriginal people have always welcomed each other into country, but as a nation we've performed that ritual since 1988, since our Western bicentennial. We do it as a way of doing two things. One, acknowledging that all Australia proceeds from a much earlier route than British colonisation, and two, to acknowledge what it means to be in a place that has been continuously occupied by human culture for somewhere between 60 to 100,000 years. Part of what it makes me think about today, because it would be strange to stand here and say I want to acknowledge the Irish ancestors past and present and their leaders emerging, although I do. The reason we do it in Australia is because it's a way of marking who we are. It's a way of talking about being human in the 21st century by referring back to events that are 60 to 100,000 years old. What that suggests to me is that the business of being human is always cultural. It's performed. It is political and contested, and it changes over time. What it also means in Australia, at least, is that you can't talk about being human in the 21st century without talking about what it means to have been human in 60,000 centuries that preceded it. And when in Australia we talk about building new technology, I at least do it acutely aware that I am building technology in a place that has the oldest technical systems ever made by human beings. Some 1,000 kilometres from where I apply my trade is the oldest technical system built by human beings that we know of. It's a set of fish traps. It is your stone tools designed to change the way water moves through a series of rivers and guarantee a constant supply of fish for the Aboriginal people who live there. That system was used for nearly 40,000 years. It only stopped being used in the 1930s. So the notion of humanness there is an incredibly long one. So for me, when I think about what does it mean to talk about being human in the 21st century, it's to acknowledge all the versions of human that have come before. When we want to think about what does it mean to talk about being human in a world being remade by technology, I think everyone that's come before me has made this point. Technology didn't get invented in the last 5 years. AI didn't create an intervention into what it means to be human. It's a continuity of multiple interventions by humans and by technical systems and the dialogue that's created. I want to tell you just 3 stories because for me they are indexical stories that remind me that the notion of being human is an expansive one and one that's often being contested and debated. So let's pick one that's 200 years old. This is the 200th anniversary of the Frankenstein story. 200 years ago that Mary Shelley's novel became, or novella became a novel and went into publication. It has stayed continuously thus. And it tells the story of a doctor, Frankenstein, who takes the most recent technology of his day, electricity, although electricity doesn't actually turn up in the book until 1836 edition. In the first edition it is merely chemical ideas. But it tells the story of a doctor who takes the most recent technology at his disposal and makes a creature come to life. And the arc of that story is about humans teaching that creature how to be or not to be human. And the creature spends its time peering through holes in the wall, desperately trying to work out what are the rules by which humanness is made. And ultimately, humans reject that creature because it doesn't quite learn the rules. That story has endured for 200 years, in some ways for a couple of reasons. One, because the notion of the idea of when humans get to make life is a complicated one, and it's a moral play as much as a technical play. But also because there's something really seductive in the idea that as humans we might get to make something, perhaps in our own image, perhaps better than ourselves, certainly different than ourselves, but that it will have the echoes of ourselves running through it, and we will take our language to give it shape and give it form. Now, of course, Shelley borrowed that story. It's the story of the golem in the shtetls in Prague. It's the story of a rabbi making life using the word of God in the forehead of a creature. But it's also the story of electricity, it's the story of computers, and it's the story of AI. In 1915, Scientific America carried an article about a thing that was described in the headline as the great brass brain of Norfolk. An excellent headline, which causes you to want to read the rest of the article. Think of it as 1915 clickbait. And were you to read that article, as I now have, as I chase that story across many historical contexts, you would find two men whose names we do not remember, two men named Roland Harris and E.G. Fisher, who created a machine. It was about 3 meters long, 2 meters high, it weighed 1,100 kilograms. It was a mechanical computer. It calculated the tides. It was built by the United States Coastal Service to work out how to determine where the water was moving. It stayed in service from when it was first built in 1915 to when it was decommissioned in the 1960s. When it was first built, it was called the giant brass brain. By the time they decommissioned it, it was known as the old brass brain. What's wonderful about that is that in making sense of that piece of machinery, the only language its progenitors could find, and the only language the journalists could find to describe it, was to borrow the language of humans. It wasn't a brain, it was a set of cogs and levers and pulleys, but to make it make sense, they made it human, they called it a brain. That language of the notion of extending humanness to mechanical objects is, for me, an interesting move. It's a move of literature in the 19th century. In the 20th century, it's a move of technologists. And by 1956, a number of men gathered at Dartmouth College in America. You heard one of them referenced on stage, Tim Marvin Minsky, but also Claude Shannon and John McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy. And they spelled out a research agenda and coined a phrase, and the phrase they coined was artificial intelligence. And the research agenda they spelled was what to do with computing in 1956, when the power of computing seemed limitless. And they said that computing in this artificial intelligent world would do four things. It would make machines use language. They would form abstractions and concepts. They would solve the kind of problems now reserved for humans. A delightful ambit claim, if ever I heard one. And that the machines would improve themselves. In 1956, the move to make the technology like us was to say it was about those things. It was about language, it was about abstractions, it was about problems now reserved for humans, and about an ability to learn. So why am I telling you those stories? Why do I want to tell you about Frankenstein and the giant brass brain and artificial intelligence? Well, the thing about all those stories, and the thing for me about the notion of humanness, is that that's not an easy definition. What does it mean to be human? Well, who gets to decide that? Who gets to decide what is human, and under what circumstances? 3 weeks ago in Australia, we celebrated an unexpected anniversary. It had been a year since we passed a gay marriage referendum in Australia, making it legal to marry if you were homosexual. You did it slightly earlier here, and I'm awfully proud that that's true. But that means until 2015 in this country, other people decided what it meant to be fully human. What it meant to be fully human turned out to be not a simple act, it was a political act. The thing about the notion of who gets to say who is human means that you're always saying someone isn't. And the entire history, in some ways, of any culture I can think of is that what it means to be human is usually what it means to not be like the people on the other side. On the other side of the river, on the other side of the fence, on the other side of the ocean. And the notion of saying somehow that what it means to be human in the 21st century is simple as perhaps a hope rather than a reality. And that what I know as an anthropologist is that who gets to decide to be human, what it means to be human, who is human, and under what circumstances, those are not easy questions. Those are questions that aren't questions determined by technology, but questions that we will arrive through technology. But ultimately the notion of who gets to be human and why that matters, and whether or not we get to say some things are or aren't human, is a question not just of technology, but of, I would have said, morals and ethics and societies. And frankly, the notion that some of us get to grant humanness to others or not is an awesome and awful responsibility. So that I want to end this episode. Thank you.
Thank you to our 4 speakers for 4 fabulous talks. You know, it's absolutely wonderful. So we will take questions from the audience, but to allow for as many questions as possible. We don't want speeches, we just want clear, direct questions. And please use a microphone and please introduce yourself so the speakers know who's asking the question. We'll take 3 or 4 questions, come back to the panel, and then we'll come back to you. So could you raise hands so we have a sense of where the questions are coming from, so we can get mics to you? Who'd like to kick it off? This isn't like the usual audience. There's a lady in the middle here. Anyone else? You just pass that along. Well, why don't you start? It's Anna. Is it? Okay. Yeah. Please introduce yourself.
Anna Bartsch from the Hub, and of course it's very difficult to start, and it's very exciting to listen to you, but you will never be satisfied, yes, because of this question, how much is it, opening a lot of things. But my question is simple. What can you say about the relation toward nature? Because I think technology is, in majority, is the dominant that you are speaking about.
Thank you very much, Anna. Any other questions? There's one at the back, and then it's Deepak. So yeah. Please.
So I just wanted to ask.
Your name?
Oh, sorry. My name is Kinea. So I just wanted to ask that, for centuries and centuries, spirituality and religion structure the way to express and to define what it is to be human. And I really have the impression that in technology today, we don't spend time talking about this, which is so important. So I would like to know your thought about spirituality and technology and how it can be linked to ethics, because that's what matters most, how we're going to be technically moral. But I just want to know the link you think about spirituality and stuff.
Thank you very much. There was another question just here. So if you come down.
Hi, my name is Deepak, and my question is to Professor Bell. That continuing on to your talk, a couple of years back I read an article which spoke about our understanding of our brain depends on the latest technology. So 18th century we conceived brain as machines and levers. Then now we consider brains as CPU on the line of computers. So how do you see that interpretation of brain and being human?
Okay, thank you very much. And then we'll take one more here, this lady in the white.
Hi, my name is Gunista. I was just thinking about the human obsolescence in the context of climate change, because I thought that perhaps we will make ourselves obsolete, not the machines. And the thing is that those machines and EI and all the kind of infrastructure is pretty energy consuming, and we might be much more sustainable and much more efficient when it comes to consuming resources, when it comes to functioning. So, and I think the machines might they need energy, they need to be kept cool to operate, and so on and so on. So perhaps we are kind of going in the, wrong direction a bit, because it's not about efficiency and who is smarter. It's who is more sustainable and won't blow up the air. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, there's 4 great questions just to get things kicked off. I don't know who in the panel would like to start. Just there's an awful lot there. Genevieve, there was a specific one for you, but also there's 3 more general ones. Do you want to just kick off the conversation?
Yeah, so in reverse order for me, actually. Listen, I think the piece about the environment and sustainability piece is hugely important, and I think one of the pieces we aren't good at talking about when we talk about both artificial intelligence, data, the cloud, is we're not good at acknowledging how much energy is already being consumed by that. So the most recent statistics I saw from 6 months ago were that 10% of the world's energy budget is consumed by the cloud. So, yeah, that's a staggering number, right? So that's, none of us manage it individually, but the servers of the world, the server farms of the world are consuming an actual double-digit piece of the world's energy budget. And whilst companies like Intel, with whom I still work, are determined to decrease the energy budget of every piece of silicon generation on generation, we're also determined to increase the density, and so somewhere that is a bad trade-off. So I'm not sure that I want to say we'll make ourselves obsolete, but I do think there's a piece that says the demands we make as citizens about the technical systems that are built around us are different than perhaps they should be, and there are ways we might want to think about it in other formulations, so that piece is hugely important. And can I just, actually, I don't have an answer to that. We think about our brains as computers, because I live in a world that hasn't always been true, and I think actually what's more interesting is that we think about computers as being brains, and I think that may be a misleading piece. The religion one's the one for me that's interesting, partly because I'm a historian of technology among many other useless things I do. I'm really interested in thinking about the way religious systems have structured and funded technological innovation until really the 20th century. Most of the sites and sources of technological innovation were funded by religious institutions because that's where the money sat. And for a really long time there wasn't a strong notion that the use of technology was somehow antithetical to religious practice. So, whether it's the first automata made by the Al Jazeera and the Bazou brothers in Islam in the 10th and 12th centuries, the things they were making that were automata were all about how did you wash your hands for prayer without your hands touching the ground, and it was making peacocks that had water magically pour out of their mouths. So these beautiful automata. So for me there's something about imagining those systems aren't as antithetical. And truthfully, if you look at Japanese robotics, they come from a different place. So the preeminent Japanese roboticist, who I think would have a completely different answer to transhumanism, a man named Mori, he's been arguing for about 35 years now that the ultimate endpoint of the robotic revolution is not that humans will become robots or that those two things will apply, but that robots are on a different pathway, and he says that he thinks that robots will be better Buddhists than humans will be because they're capable of infinite patience and infinite grace. And so he imagines a world in which the robotic objects are themselves religious objects because of their capacity. Yeah, they're monks, basically. Yeah.
Laura.
I know where you go with that.
It's Genevieve. I think that the question about the kind of the implication, thinking about humans and the natural world that we're in, I think there's this curious disembodiment that we are experiencing as we kind of inhabit a digital world, and it's having a profound effect on our kind of connection with the real world. And you start to see it in a lot of behaviors. I mean, there's a lot of anonymity and a lot of behaviors that would have been considered unacceptable in traditional cultures are playing out in digital cultures. And there's also this migration back into the real world, where if you are pervasively living in a digital world, you can act out in ways in the kind of natural world that is more digital. And so I think you kind of can't say that it's not an either or. I think the natural world is becoming a kind of a stage where we're acting out this kind of blurring of behaviors that are digital behaviors, and the degree to which we have become more and more disembodied. I mean, I think Ben, we work with Ben, he's sitting here in the audience. He's talks a lot about the kind of the psychology of being embodied, and whatever you do, you experience the world through not just your brain, but also your place in the world. And a lot of technologies has allowed us to kind of separate our experiences out of our bodies. And that kind of disconnect that is unprecedented, I think, means that when we re-inhabit the physical world, we have a different set of kind of expectations and behaviors. And I think a bigger question is, there's behavior seeping and migrating back in. There's a lack of maybe, there's almost like people have there's less interest in the real world. There's a lot more interest in the digital world. And so it shows there's a degree of kind of disregard for what's happening. And I think it's really profoundly concerning that people are preoccupied less with the real world and more with the digital space.
Mark, I was going to say, Mark, use the mic if you wouldn't
I
mind.
might just say something to follow on from that about the idea of nature and abstracting ourselves from nature. Because I mean, I think in a way that's like part of what I was writing about in my last book. But this book that I've just finished writing is kind of about this sort of apocalyptic moment that we find ourselves in, and this idea that we might be kind of on the verge of, destroying, if not nature, then our ability to live in nature. And I was thinking, listening to what you said about, I have a friend who's a wilderness guide who takes people out into very wild places like the Scottish Highlands and places in the Basque Country in Spain and so on. And part of what he does is he leaves them alone for periods of sort of 24 hours, 48 hours or whatever, on their own, with a view to sort of reconnecting with nature. And I did this last year with a view to kind of reconnecting with nature. And it was a very interesting, occasionally profound, but mostly just kind of boring experience. But I think like part of what I was trying to do was, because I'm obsessed with where we are in terms of climate change and our sort of inability to sort of see ourselves as in any way connected with nature. I was trying to sort of do that on a personal level. And I think basically I failed, because I was looking for some kind of moment of transcendence or something, some kind of moment where the wilderness or where the nature kind of gave me permission to be in it or something like that. And I did have a strange moment of transcendence, but it had to do with like a fighter jet coming through the valley where I was, where I'd been for 24 hours on my own, flying very closely over my head. And it was this deeply, actually sublime moment for me, but it wasn't, it didn't come from where I was looking for it from. So I think some kind of insight was granted to me about the unwisdom of trying to make clean definitions between nature and technology. I'm not quite sure what that insight is. You'll have to get back to me. But I wanted to say something about the question from up there, from you, about religion and technology and so on. And I think it's probably true to say that communications technology, and particularly the internet, has given us a huge amount of, if not information per se, then access to information. And it seems as though we have more information at our fingertips, as the saying goes now, than we ever did before. But it also feels as though we kind of know less, or we have less grounding in our knowledge or whatever. It seems to me that we're kind of up to our eyeballs in a kind of a decomposing mulch of fact and half-fact and sort of supposition and so on. So it seems that technology has given us the ability to have facts and have information, but not to know much. And I think that was one of the things that religion did, obviously. It might not have been factual knowledge, but you knew where you were in the world. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, but it was definitely part of, like, to use the phrase, what it meant to be human for a very long time, and we seem to no longer have that. And one of the things I saw when I was writing my book, To Be a Machine, was that technology, in this strange sort of way, is becoming the vector of certain ideas that were the preserve of religion in the past. Things like the idea that we might live forever, as I talked about, and a way of sort of taking ourselves out of the sort of impoverished human condition. But it doesn't give us that sense of knowing. It doesn't give us that sense of knowing your place in the world. And I think that that's a real, I don't want to say it's a loss, but it's definitely like a radical difference in where we find ourselves now. And it's, it's not necessarily the last 5 years or anything. It's, the last 100 years or whatever. But it's very distinct now, and it seems to be reaching some kind of crisis point, I think. Sorry, that's quite depressing. I didn't really.
Do you know, the apocalyptic moment, I studied the 17th century, there's a lot of apocalyptic moments, and sometimes it goes back to some of the earlier conversations, to what extent is this truly apocalyptic or not? It's always apocalyptic, exactly. Do you want to pass on to Kevin? I don't know if you've any, you've got your own mic.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So, I did, yeah. So I want to touch on a few of those questions, because I think the answer is tied up together. First, to Anna's question about nature and how we think about that. There are debates ongoing about the definition of personhood, not of humanity, if we define humanity as being a species, but thinking about, you know, what level of cognition or self-awareness, for example, is required to confer legal personhood on an entity, whether it's a dolphin or a chimpanzee or an octopus or an android. Those questions, I think, don't depend on what the thing is necessarily, but on the level that it has achieved. And I guess the way I think about that is that there's not a clear cutoff there, that it's a graded thing. That, as Darwin said, the difference between us and other animals is one of kind, or sorry, of degree, not of kind. So when we think, and you can think that too about, you know, babies and infants, that their consciousness and their self-awareness is growing all the time, so it's not a static sort of a thing. I think the question about the brain metaphor that we use, the computer metaphor that we use right now, ties back into this idea that I mentioned earlier about an overly reductionist, mechanistic view of the human brain and the human mind. And it's an irony to me that the more and more we learn from neuroscience about how the brain works, the further and further we seem to get from explaining how the mind works, or at least we seem to be explaining away the mind. We don't need it. It's, you know, thoughts and goals and intentions and desires and beliefs, they feel like they're epiphenomena if we can just explain everything and the firing of some neural circuits. So I don't think that that's right. I don't think those are epiphenomena. I think they have causal power, but it's a difficult thing to try and build a framework in which you can explain how they have causal power. If the machine is just a physical thing, then how can your thoughts be moving the atoms around and determining, you know, the state of the machine? I think there is such a way to do that, but it's a bit long-winded to get into it. But I think ultimately what it means is that we have to take a non-reductionist view, not just looking at all the bits bouncing into each other, but looking at the pattern, looking at the arrangement of all those bits and what that means. And really what it means is that it's our history. It's the history of our experiences that we physically embody in our brains, in the structure of our brains as we learn things. And those changes to our physical structure of our brain then affect our actions over time. And I think to get to the point of you know, spirituality, not in a supernatural sense, but in a very natural sense, there is a way to think about a spirit, or you know, metaphorically a soul, or what you could call in neuroscience or philosophy a self, at least, that does come back to that whole structure that you have embodied into the physical structure of your brain in a way that's non-reductive. It looks at the entire pattern, and it does, I think, mean that we have to get back to some deeper philosophical, spiritual, if you like, ways of thinking about how the whole emerges from the parts, that we can't just drill down deeper and deeper and deeper, you know, to brain systems and microcircuits and individual neurons and the atoms within them. That's not where the answer is going to come. It has to come from a bigger picture, and that gets us back, I think, to a broader sense of humanity than just a very materialistic kind of deal.
I think, Genevieve, time to get in here.
It's also a place where doing the history of how technological conversations arise turns out to be really valuable, because part of the reason you had such a mechanistic notion of the work of the brain in 1956 at that conference had to do with who the other protagonist was. So at that conference were a collection of mathematicians and philosophers, but they were profoundly influenced by one American behavioral psychologist. And so there they are thinking about, all right, we need to, we think we've got all this power of computing, we think it could be like a brain, how does the brain work, we should find someone who thinks about brains, and they found B.F. Skinner. So those of you who don't know Skinner is an American behavioral psychologist who was writing against Freud and Jung and the messiness of Europe and of the notion of the unconscious and the id and all that messiness. And so he was really interested in how did you create a theory of the mind that was about the mind being like a machine. And there was something delightfully ironic about a group of people wanting to build a machine like a mind to find people who thought that a mind was like a machine, and you're like, oh my god, match made in heaven. Now, of course, the problem there is Skinner. Or let me put that differently, a problem there is Skinner. And the reason why there is a seduction of Skinner, right? So what was it in 1956 that made Skinner so appealing? What was it in 1956 that propelled a group of men to imagine that they could make a machine that would think better than a human? Because before 1956, you've come out of World War II. And what has World War II taught all of the people that gathered in Dartmouth? Well, that humans made the worst decisions that were imaginable. That during World War II, humans had built 2 nuclear bombs and dropped them. They had also architected and enacted the Holocaust. And for the people that were gathered in that room at Dartmouth College, they were trying to imagine, could they make a machine that would be less awful than humans have been? And so they were looking for imagining that a machine could be not better than humans, but different than humans, but that if you took the best of what made us human, which for them would be sort of the intellect, not the messiness of the emotion, not the superego, but this notion of a mechanistic inputs in, inputs out. There's something about giving that technology back its history that for me is a way of saying, even as we talk about these technical systems, those technical systems couldn't exist absent a whole series of human acts that preceded them, and absent a whole series of theorists that were and were in the room articulating what it was going to be human. And that moment in 1956 that in some ways charts out the agenda that Elon and Ray are still in dialogue with has this earlier moment, and that moment too has a history. And so for me there's something about, the question isn't necessarily what's the metaphor, but what's the history of the metaphor.
George, I love this. It's like,
no, I love it.
It's a great conversation.
It's kind of learning the history of. I mean, we just recently started to consider the culture of technology. And again, we're really new to it, and I think hearing the history, because I think we're encountering a really similar, really pervasive attitude. And I think it's a little bit of responding to the question around spirituality is there's we struggle to have any kind of find any space or kind of interest within a lot of kind of established tech cultures to consider any of the humanities, or any of the arts. And it's not because there's, maybe it's an elitist attitude, but it's just a sense that it would distract them. And so we had this conversation really recently with the group that we work with. And they were really generous. It's a group of technologists, and we were talking to them about, if we could somehow bring a really vivid representation of humans in all their capacities, and we could make that something that was really compatible for them working in the tech cultures, tech industries, would that be valued? And we just assumed that they would head nod, and this would be something that everyone agreed was going to be a really good thing. And they said, it just sounds like it would slow us down. And they're really good people. It's just, I think just, Genevieve has told this story about, the kind of origins of this thinking and the kind of clarity that a lot of kind of technologists have had, and the kind of, where they kind of, this is what they were inspired to do in response. And so the idea that we think that there's this absence of representation of humanity, and somehow that was something that was missed, that someone forgot to invite the humans to the party. They're like, we haven't forgotten, we've considered it, but quite frankly, it's not, and again, it's at odds with what we're attempting to do. And I think, it's that sense that it would slow us down, which is something that we encountered just last week from a group of really wonderful people that we work with who've trained as technologists. And now our job is to figure out how do you shift that perception? Like how do we move away from believing that any conversation about humanity becomes sentimental and nostalgic really quickly, and that people can't find the value in the work they're trying to do. And I think it's a real challenge for us. I think we've encountered that just last week. So it persists, as a sentiment. It's really
fascinating. Please.
So I have something to say about that.
No, don't. You can't. You have to use the mic. Sorry.
All right. I have something to say about that. We had a conversation a couple of weeks ago. My name is Julian Friedland. I'm an ethicist in business school and I'm a philosopher by training. And I've been having discussions with Accenture and many people in the room about this. And to pick up where you just left off, you asked me an interesting question at the end of our talk last time, and that was how I define humanity, as I recall, in 3 words or less. And I said critical self-reflection, and I really do think that's what Socrates was after when he said the unreflected life is not worth, unexamined life is not worth living. It's what Descartes focused on when he wanted to prove the existence of himself, that he could doubt, therefore he was. And what I'm interested in asking you, actually, Kevin, and is, do you fear, and I fear this, and I just actually wrote an article on this, the problem that I see with much of what's happening with our ability to use technology to create a cozy environment for us is that it absolves us of the need for critical thought, critical reflection. There's the idea of the frictionless environment that we're getting towards. People are finding themselves in intellectual silos where they're really not challenged so much within their groups to reconsider their own preconceptions. And me as a philosopher in business school, no less, all I'm doing basically every day is trying to challenge my students' preconceptions. And often many of my colleagues and many of the journals that I write in, and I'm concerned about whether our ability to manipulate technology so well so that we can shape the environment.
Julian, we're running out of time, really quickly.
Absolves of a need to actually shape ourselves to fit it.
Thank you very much. Margaret, do you want to?
Hi, I'm Margaret Robson. I'm just wondering, in the past, the idea of spirituality was rising above the body, and certainly in the Middle Ages, one of the things that they really objected to in people was the need to defecate, so that they had saints who didn't eat and didn't defecate, and Jesus was said his body was so perfect. Are we looking to get some kind of perfect body with technology so that we don't do it either?
I was going to say, what a question to end with, and we are going to end it there, I'm afraid, just simply because we're not going to finish. I always like to get you out for 8 o'clock. So back to our panel. There's 2 really fascinating questions: the philosophical one and the medieval literary one. Who wants to kick that off? Actually, Mark, go ahead.
The shitting question. Yeah, no, I think that's really true, and it made me think of 2 things. One of which is I'm trying to think of the guy's name, but there was a French maker of automatons, automata, Vaucanson. Yeah, I guess the 17th century. But yeah, so like one of the first. Right, one of the first. Thank you so much. One of the first automata was a duck that shat, basically, right? That was all it did. But it also made, they created a kind of feces-like substance. But it strikes me that, like when I was writing my book, I did come across various designs for post-human bodies, the kinds of humanoid structures that we would upload ourselves into and sort of live eternally in these kind of impenetrable, kind of sleek, humanoid, post-human selves. And there was no aspect of the design that had anything to do with defecation. And when I read a book called The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, which is an amazing book from, I guess, the 70s. Becker was a psychoanalyst, and he talks a lot about shitting, actually, like a lot of psychoanalysts. He connects shitting with death. And so I think there's something there about, like, in none of these designs that I see anything, not just to do with like eating and defecation, but with really the sensual kind of world at all. It was all to do with, like, as I kind of alluded to in my talk, the value that these people place on humanity is purely intellectual, purely to do with intelligence, and it's a very narrow understanding of what intelligence is. As you know, Genevieve was saying, you have to define humanity really, really tightly and sort of in an impoverished kind of way, as Skinner did, in order to convince yourself that it's possible to make a machine that could replicate humanity. And maybe shitting is part of that overall picture of humanity. Yeah.
Do you want to pass the mic on back to Kevin to go to slide?
On the pooping front, I mean, it touches on an interesting idea actually about intelligence being embodied and being enacted in the environment. That actually, you know, living things have to keep themselves organized, and that doesn't come for free. And part of the cost, you know, we have to basically suck order from the universe to keep ourselves organized. And part of the cost is that there's some byproducts that have to go out the other end. So that, I mean, there are aspects of I think, discussions around artificial intelligence about whether it will ever really be like a human being if we don't allow it to explore its environment and we don't give it, homeostasis as one of its main goals, or keeping itself alive and so on. So there are some of the baser aspects of the flesh that maybe are such an essential part of human experience that we can't actually separate intelligence from them or get intelligence without that interaction with the environment. I did just want to touch on the other question about intellectual silos, because I think it's a really, really important one. You can see it in many, many different ways. So in all of our areas of research, we're learning more and more. So we're drilling down individually deeper and deeper and deeper, and we get further and further away from each other, basically. So to be experts in any field, there's so much more to know that we just have to keep going down deeper and deeper, and that unfortunately leads to a lot of ignorance. And you can see it, I mean, for example, in what I was talking about earlier, in aspects of human nature, you can see it in terms of scientific ignorance on one front, that, many, for example, the people in sociology, some people in psychology will deny that there is any biological basis to human nature, in spite of all the evidence that there is. And then on the other hand, you have scientific arrogance, where scientists will say, well, look, the genetics says such, the heritability of intelligence is this, and just interpret that in complete ignorance of any social context or history or cultural factors. So those two things happen because the scientists and the humanities are not talking to each other. And I think then you end up with these huge ethical voids, which we saw last week in China, with this really horrendous breach of ethics in terms of doing this manipulation of human life for no good reason, without the proper technical oversight, without the proper ethical oversight. So those things can happen and do happen, and I think they're a direct consequence of us not talking to each other. And just the final point, as an educator, and someone who's involved in the educational system in college, one of the things I really, really want to do is let our students get a view, let them pop their heads up over the parapet once in a while and get a view of a perspective from a different discipline, even if it's just a little bit of an exposure, just a little bit of a mind expander to see that other perspectives actually exist, so we don't keep dragging them down in the silos with us.
It's a good plug for the Trinity Education Programme that's torturing us all at the moment. I don't know if Genevieve or Lorna want to add anything in terms of those two questions.
So the shitting question, truly the most fun question of the evening. It made me think about something. So my background before getting into tech was I had a background in fashion and textiles, and so people have talked about possibly the cell phone and the smartphone is evidence that we've already become transhuman. But I think there's this having this history of the things that we hide and reveal about ourselves from a kind of a clothing perspective, like the parts of our body that we're embarrassed by, and the degree to which we've used artifice for so long culturally to kind of draw attention to parts of who we are and to become and to kind of disguise and to morph and to use artifice to become more than what we are. And if you think about the history of clothing, and there's this expression, the containment industry, which was all the corsetry that people used to wear, which is called the containing industry. How much we were attempting to kind of really shape ourselves into being a kind of an unnatural form and to aspire to being something that was perfect. And I think there's so much evidence, again, it's back to, if we look at the tools we build, but if we look at what we've done to our bodies over generations, the things that we've done to adapt them and to appear to be, meeting some ideal image of what humans and beauty is something that it's endured for a long time. And I think that nowhere in that clothing story has there been an emphasis on shitting.
Yes.
Genevieve?
Far be it to resist the temptation to talk about defecation. I want to push that one step further, if you can imagine what that might be, which is, and I'm not going there, which is to suggest that one of the complexities of current technical systems is that they all actually already imagine bodies for us, and bodies of particular types. So anyone in the room who is under about 160 centimeters knows that automatic doors don't open when you stand in front of them, you need to wave at them. That's because those automatic doors are benched at a certain height with a 2 sigma delta we are the bottom of that floor. Basically, those doors imagine what the perfect body is for whom they should open. The same way cameras respond to a particular configuration of skin and contrast and eye color that is a legacy from Kodachrome and even Matthew Brady back in the Confederate armies and the Civil War. every piece of technology around us imagines the body that should be its ideal user. Someone imagined that body and made the technical system around it. But one of the challenges we have is that we operate in a world where the perfect body was already imagined and it's never yours. But the problem is, unlike a corset which announces what the perfect body should be, and then you have to think how the hell you're going to get in it, those doors don't run around going, "Oi, sunshine, you're short." Well, they basically just don't do anything. And so one of the challenges we have is how do you disinter the image of the body and then, frankly, the practice and the activity and the process, because those are all the things that those systems are imagining for us. And unlike the clothing and the built world that we know how to interrogate, the one that is moving into existence, that imagines our bodies too, is much less clear. And so for me, thinking about the piece about what does it mean to be human is, again, it's who's human and who gets to decide what that human is. And oh, by the way, it's almost never my body or your body. Hence it's Elon Musk. There's something there about how do we then talk about all the other pieces, right, that we haven't talked about in the human piece, about what it means to talk about gender and race and class and lived experience and sexuality and religion and all those other pieces, because all of those get woven into the story, but they never get revealed.
Yeah. Do you know, we're going to wrap things up, and what I'd like our four speakers to do is, if there's one message they would like you to go out of this room remembering, what is that key message from each of our speakers, just to try and sort of pull things together a little bit. Such a huge topic, and obviously this is the beginning of a conversation. So again, I don't know, why don't we just, Kevin, start with you. If you have one key message based on this evening, what is it?
I guess it would be that even if we do have a material basis, even if some aspects of our psychology can be predicted in a fuzzy kind of a way from our genes or from looking at our brains, that actually we are all born completely unique. Even if we cloned each other or cloned 100 times, you would have 100 different persons coming out of that. So I find something comforting in that the tech will never get beyond some certain limit of our own personal uniqueness.
Okay, that's very helpful. Mark, and you'll need the mic.
Yeah, I think I would say that we should probably resist any kind of reductive definition of what it means to be human. I think the minute you try to put a definition on it is the moment where I would want to pull back. So yeah, any kind of mechanistic view of humanity is, I think, dangerous. We probably don't have time to go into, but we probably all already did anyway. So.
Genevieve.
And I want to borrow Mark's notion, because I think he's right, that we should ask why we're asking. So, the fact that we are asking the question about what it means to be human indexes the anxiety, right? So what is it about that question that is so hard to shake in 2018 that we keep asking it? And that, for me, is the question, right? What is it in the question? And what are we both, I think, silencing and making visible all at the same time?
Thank you. Lorna.
So one thing that we were acutely aware of recently is, again, in the kind of tech cultures, we talk about humans as being three things. They're either a user, they're a customer, or they're an employee. So there's three, there's narratives around people. They're consuming something that you're making, your service or your product. They're using it. They're the person. So it's very transactional. And I think, what's important is to consider how we move, we can shift the conversation. It's very challenging. But as we acknowledge the silos that exist across all the different disciplines, not agreeing a way to talk about human, we're never going to be able to kind of get any clarity of thought, to be able to kind of compete with the clarity that exists right now within tech cultures in terms of their certainty and their optimism themselves around the direction they're going in. And so I think, one, we need to get some kind of consensus and agreement. We need to really start to work across the silos and to try and really broaden this aperture about how when we talk about humans, it's not just someone consuming a product for us. And so I think collaboration will be really important to get this kind of general sense of what it means to be human.
And that sets up very nicely, actually, the series that we're going to be running. Just kicking it off, the first talk in the What It Means to Be Human series will be delivered by Trinity's Professor of Biochemistry, and immunology, Luke O'Neill, who has just authored a book called Humanology, A Scientist's Guide to Our Amazing Existence. So that will be in here, oh well, maybe not in here, it'll be somewhere in Trinity, on the 31st of January, and we're just, the booking is going to go live probably tomorrow or the next day. And again, hopefully you'll be able to join us for that. There's two other quick plugs that I just want to make. Our Dublin and the Changing City series continues. The next instalment is on the 6th of December, and this session will consider the challenge of representing other Dublins and Dublin's others. That series has just been absolutely fantastic. So if you're free, there's so much on this week, but if you're free on Thursday night, hopefully you can make it. The other thing is we've got a really special event on the 7th, on Friday at 11 o'clock. So a woman called Catherine Corliss, whom I'm sure is known to everybody in the audience, is getting an honorary degree from Trinity on Friday, and we are doing an in conversation with her. Again, I think the venue is the Burke, but Aoife McLysett and I were her nominators, and we'll be in conversation with Catherine Corliss at 11 o'clock on Friday. Again, we'd love you to join us for that. So this is our last Behind the Headlines for the year. We'd like to extend our, festive greetings, but hope we'll see you all again in 2019 for the new series and for all of the other events at the Hub. And I just simply want to close by thanking you all for coming. I'm sorry we didn't have more time for questions, but I think the quality of the panel, and just the way that they were engaging with those big questions we had. So if you could all join with me in thanking our panel again.